The first few years for the Zelda series were very odd. The first Zelda game was one of its kind, a truly revolutionary dungeon crawler experience. The second game is a 2D platformer that most call the worst game in the entire franchise, and then the third game is like the first game but with 10 times the stuff. Since these games are so old nowadays, there are a lot of people who still consider them to be the pinnacle of their genre and very good, while there are also a lot of people who call all three of these games dated and not fun to play anymore. I'm a pretty young guy, I didn't grow up with any of these games, but I did play through all three of them within the last year, and I think I have a pretty good idea of whether or not they hold up now. So, let's talk about the classic Zelda games. The first Zelda game is surprisingly different from the rest of the series because it is a very open game with a lot of freedom, kinda like Breath of the Wild, but while this may sound appealing, it's actually very detrimental to the game as a whole. You cannot get through Zelda 1 in a reasonable amount of time without using a guide, and it's not like there are just a couple of confusing parts, it's all confusing. The random men around the map all give you riddles instead of actual advice or directions, there are no in-game pointers for where the dungeons are, and even if you do find a dungeon, there's a very good chance that you accidentally found it in the wrong order and you'll barely be able to complete it. There is no sense of direction, there is no guidance, and when a game is completely open-ended like Zelda 1 is, that's a big problem. Zelda 1 did come with an instruction booklet back in the day, and if you want to use the manual, you can get a physical version, or you can look it up online, but I don't see how that's any different from actually using a guide. Zelda 1 is also a very challenging game, and that's not saying that the enemies are complicated or the boss fights are fun and interesting to fight, that's just saying that fighting enemies in this game is a nightmare. Because of this game's age, the combat is very restrictive and there aren't a lot of options for the player, so most of the time your only option is to try and attack an enemy with your sword, except your sword is unbelievably small and narrow, so actually spacing a good attack consistently is very difficult. This is especially frustrating when there are multiple enemies moving around on the screen, because the player basically stands no chance fighting off multiple enemies with such a small weapon. In a lot of games, even back in the day with challenging combat like this, there will at least be some reasonable way for players to regain their health, but getting a health potion in Zelda 1 costs 40 rupees or more, and getting rupees consistently is basically impossible in Zelda 1, so no matter what way you cut it, the combat in Zelda 1 is far too punishing and far too restrictive, and I think it was a big hindrance to my experience with the game, and probably a lot of others. Luckily, it's not all bad because Zelda 1 is a very good looking NES game with a great soundtrack, and sure, you can look back at the graphics in Zelda 1 and compare it to games nowadays, and it's pretty embarrassing, but looking back at a lot of NES games, I would say Zelda 1 looks pretty impressive. I would say Zelda 1 also has a pretty good soundtrack with a couple of classics that will never be forgotten like the main theme, but the dungeon theme in particular is my favorite. I mean, it's just so menacing and stressful, and very much elevates the atmosphere of every dungeon in the game. Unfortunately, Zelda 1 has about 4 real songs in the entire soundtrack, and so there's a lot of missed potential, but the few songs that do exist in this game are very good. Listening to the same 4 tracks the entire game is definitely annoying and gets tedious after a while, but hey, it's an NES game, they're all like that, so that's something that can be overlooked. Speaking of the dungeons, oh man, are these dungeons surprisingly not that bad. Yeah, fighting the heaps of enemies in these dungeons makes them very tedious at times, but the boss fights are the best thing about Zelda 1, and the complete freedom you get in these dungeons is actually very beneficial. The ability to blow your way through most walls was an interesting way for the player to explore dungeons, and it also gave players who wanted to get through the game fast like me a very easy way to do so. Yes, the dungeons are basically the same every time and they do get boring after a while, but not any more boring than running around the overworld in circles. The dungeons and bosses were certainly where Zelda 1 shined, and although they don't hold up perfectly today, they really aren't that bad. Unfortunately, Not That Bad is the best that it gets for Zelda 1, and it doesn't age well at all nowadays, and that's not because it's just some NES game, it's because it's a very flawed NES game. The Donkey Kong games, Mario 1, 2, and 3, Excitebike, Dr. Mario, Dig Dug, Earthbound, there are a lot of NES games that are far more enjoyable than Zelda 1 to play nowadays, and overall it is a very dated game. But what about Zelda 2? Zelda 2 is such a weird sequel to the first game because not only is it a 2D platformer, an entirely different genre, but the direction taken with the game as a whole feels completely different to the rest of the games in the series. The soundtrack doesn't sound like Zelda, the graphics don't look like Zelda, as a whole this game doesn't feel like a true Zelda game, and that's why I think it gets so much hate. As bad as this might sound, I do believe that the visuals and music in Zelda 2 are far superior to the first game. Both games look a little strange and Zelda 2's overworld does look pretty bad, but the second you actually go into a town or a level, the game starts to look pretty fantastic, especially for when it came out. Unlike the first game, there are also a decent amount of songs in Zelda 2, and I would argue that just like Zelda 1, they're all pretty good. The battle theme, the town theme, the dungeon song, people who have played Zelda 2 know what I'm talking about, and people who haven't should go listen to those songs. I think Zelda 2 does have some real problems, which we're about to talk about, but I don't think anybody can say that the soundtrack is one of them, because this soundtrack is fantastic. Something I criticized Zelda 1 for was having unnecessarily difficult combat, and unfortunately Zelda 2 has the same problem, but in all fairness, I don't think it's quite as bad. While the combat in Zelda 2 is challenging, it doesn't feel nearly as punishing, since the extra health and items the player can get to make combat easier are far more accessible. I also think that some of the enemy encounters in Zelda 2 are very fun and challenging to fight, which could also be said of the boss fights in Zelda 1, but not nearly to the same level. The combat as a whole just felt a little bit more complicated than the first game despite being a platformer, which is probably why it's more difficult to some people, but I found it to be a lot more fun than the first game. That's not to say the combat still isn't absurd at times, because it is, but I can actually enjoy the combat in this game when it's not crazy challenging, and I can't say the same for Zelda 1. The dungeons are also completely different, yet very fun. They're super simple since it was basically impossible to make a complicated dungeon in such a limited space, but for what they are, they really aren't that bad. Just like the first game, the worst thing about these dungeons is the enemies within them being frustrating to fight, but since I enjoyed the combat in this game way more, that really wasn't a big problem, and that meant dungeons in Zelda 2 were a lot more fun. The dungeons in Zelda 2 are still very similar to one another and lack a lot of the personality that made dungeons in the later games so good, but I truly think that the dungeons in this game are decent, and honestly, so is the entire game. It's still challenging, it still lacks content, and it doesn't feel like a true Zelda game, but I can't think of a lot of things good about it, and I think it's very overlooked. It didn't age the best, it's still a 5 or a 6 out of 10 by modern standards, but it certainly isn't bad. The final retro Zelda game is A Link to the Past, and right before you even play the game it hits you with the The music in this game is such an improvement from the first two games, and A Link to the Past soundtrack still holds up as a phenomenal soundtrack even by today's standards. Nearly every song represents its area perfectly and sounds so great on its own, and even when a song isn't dedicated to one area, it still turns out great. The Hyrule field theme is triumphant and exciting, making the player feel motivated to explore this bright and beautiful world. It really encapsulates that feeling of adventure in this game and every Zelda game to come. The Dark World is still regarded as one of the best songs in the entire series, and it's no secret why. It bears a lot of resemblance to the Hyrule field theme, except it has this added layer of pressure, making the player feel like their quest matters more than it ever did before. Power of the Gods, is just good. The core gameplay of A Link to the Past is very similar to Zelda 1 in a lot of ways, but A Link to the Past patched up all of the flaws that often made Zelda 1 so frustrating to play through, particularly with the combat. First of all, Link's sword has a sweeping attack that goes in all directions in front of him along with a spin attack, which is far more user-friendly than aiming with the small and narrow sword from Zelda 1. Second of all, getting access to healing items is significantly easier in A Link to the Past, since not only are healing potions cheap, but you don't have to go out of your way to buy them. And finally, the player gains a decent amount of ranged weapons that can be used constantly throughout the game, which is what was really missing from the first game and made it so difficult. The difficulty is actually balanced in A Link to the Past, and some of the enemies themselves are also pretty fun to fight. And yeah, there are still some obnoxious ones, and some of them are very difficult to deal with, but most enemies in in A Link to the Past have very basic and enjoyable attack patterns. The boss fights are also significantly improved from the first two games in A Link to the Past, which may sound crazy considering the boss fights were the best things about those first two games, but I'm not exaggerating when I say that A Link to the Past may have the best boss lineup in the entire Zelda series. As a whole, the difficulty in A Link to the Past gets gradually harder as the player makes progress, which is exactly what a game like this should be like. The first few hours in A Link to the Past are very easy, but as you go through more dungeons and challenges, the difficulty ramps up until it's very difficult once again, but only near the end. Basically, A Link to the Past is a well-designed game. A Link to the Past looks really good, it sounds really good, the gameplay is great, but what I really think A Link to the Past did so well, arguably better than anything else, was innovate and evolve the series into what we know and love now. Just the intro screen tells you everything you need to know about this game. You've got the classic Zelda logo, the Master Sword to the left, the Triforce behind it, and the Kingdom of Hyrule along with the castle walls as the background. Even the musical themes you may think came from games like Ocarina of Time or even anything later actually originated in A Link to the Past. Ganondorf's theme and Zelda's Lullaby were actually in this game first, they just had slightly different names and less people grew up with them. The Master Sword, the traditional Zelda gameplay loop, the story of the Triforce, many of Zelda's iconic songs, and everything else also started with this game. Not only that, but this is still a great game to experience even today. It's a small, self-contained grand adventure with a considerable lack of problems. I would seriously give it an 8 or a 9 out of 10, even now, and I can confidently say that A Link to the Past aged very well.